Settle in, let your eyes grow heavy, and imagine the soft, rhythmic lap of waves against ancient stone wall. Tonight, we drift far from the mainland's restless chatter to a small, windswept island monastery where time slowed to the measured hum of tides and the echo of whispered prayers. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a narrow causeway, damp with sea spray. Behind you lies the world of kings and traders, bustling towns and clattering carts. Ahead, rising from the mist like a stone dream, is a cluster of weathered buildings. Simple, sturdy, and enduring. In this calm, we will wander through the daily life of monks who sought isolation not as punishment but as a pathway to something greater. We'll explore their routines and rituals, their quiet struggles and small comforts, the stark coldness of their stone cells, and the fragile warmth of brotherhood within those walls. Breathe deeply. Let the salt air clear your mind as we cross the threshold together, into a life of solitude and devotion, where each day began with bells in the darkness, and ended with silence broken only by the wind and the sea. Segment 1. Daily life immersion. Imagine yourself on a small, weather-beaten island, miles from any bustling port or crowded village. The sea surrounds you on all sides, a vast, restless presence that hums through every stone of the monastery's thick walls. There is no torchlight on the distant shore, no echo of distant laughter or cartwheels on muddy roads, only the endless whisper of the tide and the sigh of the wind weaving through low stone buildings. It is very early, long before dawn. The sky above is not yet a true black but a deep, soft gray that hints at morning. Inside your cell, a room hardly bigger than a shepherdess hut, the air is heavy with the briny damp that never fully leaves these stones. You sleep on a rough straw mattress laid atop wooden planks, and even through the coarse blanket you can feel the chill that the sea breathes through every crack and crevice. You are not the only one awake. Even in this hush, the monastery feels alive in its stillness. You might hear the quiet rustle of another monk shifting on his straw bed, or the faint scrape of feet as someone rises to stoke the dying embers in the communal hearth before the first prayers. Each sound is absorbed by the thick walls, making everything feel both intimate and distant, like the echo of your own heartbeat under layers of wool and linen. Outside your narrow window slit, the wind carries the briny scent of kelp and salt. Somewhere in the distance, the sea thrums against the rocks that ring the island like a protective hand, or a cage, depending on your heart's leanings this morning. You draw your robe tighter, wool rough against your skin, and pull yourself to sitting. Your knees creaked from nights sleeping on hard boards. You pause a moment, adjusting to and so the day begins, as it always does. A slow unfolding of work and worship, silence and chant, the hush of stone walls, and the restless call of the sea. The hours between matins and the next bell drift by like the tide outside the low monastery walls.com, yet insistent, pushing the monks steadily through their tasks. After tending to the garden's stubborn soil, you might find yourself assigned to the salt shed down near the rocky shore. It's little more than a lean-to built from rough timbers and driftwood, its roof patched with scraps of sailcloth to keep the worst of the rain out. Inside, the air is sharp with the smell of brine, seaweed, and the tanks of salt drying on wide, shallow pans. This salt is precious. In the warmer months, the brothers lay out the pans and draw seawater into them, bucket by bucket. They wait for the sun to do its work, though here on this wind-scoured island, the sun is often a fleeting guest behind veils of mist and rolling clouds. When the salt crystals form, they scrape them into small barrels to season their meager food, preserve the occasional catch of fish, or trade with the rare boats that dare the choppy crossing from the mainland. You and another monk, Brother Eamon, work side by side in silence. Now and then, he hums a line from a psalm under his breath, a sound so gentle it barely disturbs the sighing wind that curls through the open doorway. You nod to each other, acknowledging the shared effort without the need for speech. Words, after all, are a currency spent sparingly here. When the pans are tended and the barrels checked, you step outside, blinking at the bright slant of sunlight that cuts through the clouds for a few blessed moments. The sea glitters like hammered metal. Gulls wheel and cry overhead, their sharp voices, a reminder of the world's untamed edge just beyond these walls. A path winds back up from the shore toward the main cloister, a simple courtyard ringed by squat stone buildings with moss creeping along their bases. You pass the small cemetery on your left, a low plot marked by simple wooden crosses and a few lichen-covered stones. There is no grandeur here in death, just a gentle reminder that each life folds back into the island's memory. one more layer of prayer whispered into the earth. Near the cloister, the scriptorium hums with the soft scratch of quills on parchment. Through the open shutters, you catch a glimpse of Brother Thomas bent over a wide oak desk, his brow furrowed in concentration as he copies lines from a crumbling manuscript rescued from the mainland years ago. His fingers are ink-stained, and the thin parchment flutters slightly in the draught that slips through cracked glass. The scriptorium is a place of quiet industry. Here, the monks preserve not only scripture, but also fragments of herbal knowledge, snippets of local lore, and old, battered chronicles that record storms, famines, and the occasional shipwreck that brought unexpected guests to the island's stony embrace. The smell inside is a comforting blend of ink, vellum, beeswax, and the faint tang of the sea that seeps into everything. Sometimes, if your tasks allow, you might join them, warming your chilled hands over a stubby candle before taking up your quill. The work is slow and demands patience, but there is peace in the steady loop of the script, the careful adornment of a capital letter, the margin notes that drift like murmurs between centuries. The next bell tolls softly, calling you and your brothers back to the chapel. The wind carries the sound across the courtyard, stirring the ivy that clings to the cloister walls. You pause for a moment, letting the salt breeze cool your damp brow, before stepping back inside the hush of stone and candlelight. Terce the third hour is shorter than matins. The chant is familiar now, the same verses that have marked this hour for decades, maybe centuries. Each word is a thread in the fabric of life here, binding you to the cycle of days that repeat yet always feel slightly new. The stone walls, the flicker of lamps, the sound of the sea just beyond. They remind you that even in stillness, life drifts forward, shaped by the endless breath of the tide. After the prayers, you gather again for the midday meal. The refectory feels warmer now. The brazier burns brighter, fed by driftwood collected from the shore. Today's stew is thin but hot, a mix of root vegetables, a scrap of fish flaked into the broth, a small blessing. Again, silence rules the hall. Another brother reads from a psalter, his voice steady and calm. You listen not so much to the meaning as to the rhythm, a background hum that settles your mind as you soak a piece of coarse bread in the broth. The meal is quick, practical, yet there is comfort in its repetition. After the meal, some monks return to their scribes' benches. Others tend to the animals in the sheltered yard. You head to the small workshop tucked against the monastery's south wall, a place where repairs are made. Simple tools fashioned and the occasional piece of driftwood carved into a humble cross or a rosary bead. Inside, the air smells of sawdust and lamp oil. The workbench is rough-hewn, its surface scored with old cuts and dark stains from pitch and wax. A brother sits nearby, winding twine around the shaft of a wooden rake. He glances up, nods in greeting, then returns to his task, the quiet scrape of his knife mingling with the soft tick of the wind outside. You pick up a broken bucket, its handle split from months of use hauling seawater and garden scraps. With slow, deliberate care, you fit the pieces together, binding them with thin strips of leather cut from an old sandal. Nothing goes to waste here. Every scrap finds new life if it can. Time passes gently in the workshop. You pause now and then to flex your stiff fingers to listen to the muted hum of the island. Just beyond the walls, the endless hush of waves, the distant cries of seabirds, the occasional creak of the chapel door as a brother slips in for private prayer. When your repairs are done, you carry the mended bucket back to its place near the rain barrel. You stand for a moment in the courtyard, watching as gulls swoop and wheel overhead, their white wings catching the pale sunlight that slips through the restless clouds. Cold air that curls around your neck like a living thing. You say a soft, private prayer, the words forming small puffs of steam that quickly vanish into the shadows. Slowly, you slip your bare feet onto the chill stone floor. You find your sandals by touch, rough, leather, stiff, with a constant damp. There is no rush. In this place, haste is not only frowned upon, it is unnecessary. Time moves in measured steps, marked by the bells that call you to prayer, to work, to meals, to sleep, and back again. Outside, the wider world stumbles through feasts and battles, harvests and famine, ambition and betrayal. But here, life drifts, like the tide, forward and back, day after day. In the corridor outside your cell, the air is thick with a familiar blend of scents. Smoke from the hearth, the faint tang of tallow from the candles flickering in irons, and the musty undertone of old stone worn smooth by generations of sandaled feet. A few brothers gather near the chapel door already, heads bowed, robes brushing the flagstones. Their silhouettes are almost indistinguishable in the dim light. They do not speak. Words belong to the hours after matins, when the world is a little more awake. The chapel itself feels like the heart of this place. A simple, square room with heavy beams overhead, rafters darkened by centuries of soot from oil lamps. The walls are bare, save for a single wooden crucifix at the far end, and a few worn benches that creak under the shifting weight of tired men. You join your place among the others, your knees finding the cold stone floor that has been knelt upon by countless souls before you. In this moment, you are connected to them. Men who knelt here long before you were born, and men who will kneel here long after you are gone. The bell sounds again, a soft, deliberate toll that seems to slip into your bones, rather than pierce the air, and then the chanting begins. Low, steady, like the murmur of the sea outside these walls. The Latin words rise and fall, ancient syllables shaping the darkness into something ordered and known. You do not think too deeply on their meaning. The repetition is the point. The rhythm is the bomb. For the next hour, the monks' voices weave together like strands of wool in a coarse blanket, not beautiful in any showy sense, but strong, functional, meant to warm the soul. Each phrase lingers, echoing faintly off the stones before settling into the hush again. The youngest brothers stumble over the verses now and then, voices cracking with fatigue, but no one notices. There is no harsh reprimand here. The world's harshness is far away. When matins ends, you stand slowly, knees stiff, back aching a little more each year. The brothers file quietly to the refectory, robes brushing against each other like reeds in a marsh. There is no chatter, no friendly banter. Silence is the glue that holds the day together. Each monk's thoughts as private as the stone walls are thick. The refectory is a long hall with rough-hewn tables and benches. A single brazier glows in the corner, but the warmth hardly reaches your chilled fingers. You sit beside your brothers, shoulders touching now and then, a gentle reminder that you are not alone, even if your thoughts remain locked inside you. Breakfast is a small bowl of barley porridge, a crust of bread so tough you must soak it in water to chew it. The bread tastes faintly of the sea. Flour brought in by boat when the weather allows, often stored in damp conditions that leave a trace of salt. A clay cup of weak ale or cold water accompanies the meal, enough to wash the dry bread down but not enough to quench any thirst for luxury. While you eat, one brother stands at a lectern, reading aloud in a voice that rises and falls like the wind outside. Today it is the lives of the saints, tales of holy endurance, unwavering faith, and the quiet certainty that sacrifice is its own kind of nourishment. You chew your bread slowly, each bite grounding you in this simple moment. There is no need to hurry. There is nowhere to go but here. When the meal is done, the bowls are gathered, rinsed with water carried in from the rain barrel outside. The leftover crumbs are brushed carefully from the tables, sometimes fed to the chickens that scratch in the small courtyard. Though the birds themselves are precious, their eggs saved for the sick or the very elderly among the brethren. The next bell rings, softer than the first, but unmistakable. It is time for the morning's work. You pull your robe around you, cinch the coarse rope belt at your waist, and step into the biting wind outside the refectory door. The monastery's grounds are small, but demanding. A patchwork of rocky soil must be turned and coaxed into yielding thin carrots, tough cabbages, a few onions. Small herbs cling to cracks in the garden wall. Thyme, sage, rosemary, precious for flavoring the bland meals and for treating coughs that grow worse in the damp chill of winter. Beyond the garden lies the storehouse, its roof patched with driftwood and tar. Here the monks keep barrels of salted fish, dried seaweed, and the occasional sack of grain ferried in by a trader willing to brave the choppy waters that isolate this place. There is always the worry that a storm will delay the boats, that the stores will run low before spring brings kinder seas. You take up a wooden hoe worn smooth by countless hands. Its handle bears the marks of decades, nicks and stains, spots where the grain has been polished by sweat and time. You sink its blade into the reluctant soil, feeling the resistance of rocks and stubborn roots. The work is repetitive, and that is its comfort. Each motion is a prayer of its own, a reminder that life here is a cycle of tending and reaping, of offering and receiving, of giving more than you take. The sea wind tangles your hair, carrying the cries of gulls and the distant slap of waves on the outer rocks. You pause sometimes to straighten your back, to watch the pale morning sun filter through low scudding clouds. It is cold, but the cold keeps you awake, keeps your mind focused on the earth at your feet and the sky overhead. The same sky that countless monks have studied from this island, searching for signs, for hope, for some sense that their prayers are heard beyond the endless blue. The wind shifts, carrying with it the faintest hint of coming rain, a scent that mixes with the earthy aroma of the turned garden beds and the musty tamps of the stone walls. Another bell chimes, softer this time, a gentle summons to pause, to gather once more in the chapel for none, the 9th hour of the day. The monks shuffle across the courtyard, robes trailing over the flagstones, their feet whispering against the earth that has known so many footsteps before. Inside, the chapel feels warmer than before. The flickering lamps cast long shadows on the stone walls, dancing like silent monks themselves. You kneel, the cold stone biting into your knees, but you hardly notice now. The chant begins, a steady tide of words that wash through the narrow space, soothing the mind like the sea smooths stones. When the final amen fades into the hush, you rise with the others, your joints creaking but your spirit strangely lightened. There is more work to be done before dusk, but for now, you feel anchored. Not just to the monastery, but to something larger, something enduring, like the tides that shape the island's rocky shore, day after day, year after year. You step outside once more, the wind brushing your cheeks like a reminder of the world's constant motion. The sun hangs low now, its pale rays gilding the rough edges of the cloister walls, the tops of the garden's neat rows, the rippling waves that wrap this remote place in an unending embrace. This is the rhythm of life here. Stone and sea, work and prayer, silence and the low hum of human voices blending with the wind, a pattern so old and steady that, if you close your eyes, you can almost feel it breathing around you, carrying you forward on the gentle tide of days that stretch endlessly into the grey horizon. As the afternoon edges toward evening, the island monastery begins its slow exhale. The day's work winds down, though here, even labor feels like a soft echo of the prayers that bookend every hour. You find yourself by the small flock of chickens in the sheltered yard, a narrow space ringed by rough stone walls that catch the last warmth of the sinking sun. The hens scratch at the packed earth, pecking for seeds or stray insects, their muted clucks adding a humble music to the hush. Brother Aidan, older than most and bent like a wind-shaped tree, crouches nearby, murmuring to the birds as he gathers the day's precious handful of eggs. He passes you a small basket lined with straw, and together you check each corner for any that might have rolled away into the shadows. The eggs will be stored carefully in a cool corner of the storeroom, saved for the infirmary or for feast days when the monotony of lentils and barley is briefly broken. A single egg can feel like a treasure here, a small gift of protein and comfort. As you lift the basket, you feel its warmth against your chilled palms, a tiny reminder that life, however sparse, persists here in stubborn defiance of the wind and salt. From the yard, you follow a narrow path that skirts the vegetable beds. Rows of hardy cabbages, leeks, and onions stand in stiff formation, their leaves rattling in the breeze like pages turning in an invisible book. A young novice tends the beds with a small knife, trimming away wilted leaves, muttering the names of the plants under his breath as if reciting prayers. He glances up as you pass, nods shyly, then returns to his quiet work, earth and devotion entwined in his small, calloused hands. Further on, you pass the small apiary nestled in a sunlit corner, where weathered wooden hives hum with the steady industry of bees. The honey they produce is a rare luxury, dripped onto coarse bread on high feast days, stirred into thin ale for the sick, or offered as barter when a merchant boat dares the rocky approach. You pause a moment, listening to the faint buzz that weaves with the soft shush of the sea beyond the monastery walls. Even the bees seem to understand the rhythm here. Patient, methodical, a constant hum that mirrors the monks' chants drifting through stone corridors. A distant bell tolls, its mellow note floating on the wind that tugs at the edges of your robe. The sound calls you and your brothers to the evening prayer that gathers the day's labors, thanks the Creator for small mercies, and eases weary minds into the embrace of night. You slip through the cloister's covered walkway, your sandals brushing against flagstones, worn smooth by generations of feet. Along the wall, a few narrow windows catch the last slanting rays of the sun, casting slender beams across the stone floor like bars of gold. Dust motes dance in the light, each one suspended for a moment before drifting back into the shadows. Inside the chapel, the air is warmer than you expect. Oil lamps flicker from small iron hooks, their flames mirrored in the polished surface of the single brass cross that hangs above the rough altar. The brothers gather in silence, finding their places with practiced ease, knees brushing the cold stone floor as they settle into familiar shapes. The chanting begins low at first, a hesitant murmur that grows into a steady tide of voices. Each note clings to the ancient timbers overhead, echoes from 100 years of prayers stitched into every beam and stone. You join in, your breath misting in the chill, the Latin syllables rolling off your tongue like a well-worn path. Vespers is not hurried. Here there is time enough for every psalm, every verse, every pause that lets the mind drift into the spaces between words. You feel the day's toil ease from your shoulders, carried off by the slow rise and fall of the chant, and the steady comfort of your brothers' voices weaving around you. When the final amen fades, the monks remain kneeling for a moment longer, each man adrift in his own silent prayer. Then, as one, they rise, feet whispering across the stone as they file toward the refectory for the evening meal. Outside, the dusk has deepened. The sky above the cloister glows with the faintest embers of the sun's farewell, streaks of bruised purple and burnished gold slipping behind the sea's wide horizon. A lone gull cries, its voice carried off by the wind that rattles the wooden shutters and finds every crack in the ancient walls. The wind shifts, carrying with it the faintest hint of coming rain, a scent that mixes with the earthy aroma of the turned garden beds and the musty tamps of the stone walls. Another bell chimes, softer this time, a gentle summons to pause, to gather once more in the chapel for none, the 9th hour of the day. The monks shuffle across the courtyard, robes trailing over the flagstones, their feet whispering against the earth that has known so many footsteps before. Inside, the chapel feels warmer than before. The flickering lamps cast long shadows on the stone walls, dancing like silent monks themselves. You kneel, the cold stone biting into your knees. But you hardly notice now. The chant begins, a steady tide of words that wash through the narrow space, soothing the mind like the sea smooths stones. When the final amen fades into the hush, you rise with the others, your joints creaking but your spirit strangely lightened. There is more work to be done before dusk, but for now, you feel anchored. Not just to the monastery but to something larger, something enduring, like the tides that shape the island's rocky shore, day after day, year after year. You step outside once more, the wind brushing your cheeks like a reminder of the world's constant motion. The sun hangs low now, its pale rays gilding the rough edges of the cloister walls. The tops of the garden's neat rows, the rippling waves that wrap this remote place in an unending embrace. This is the rhythm of life here. Stone and sea, work and prayer, silence and the low hum of human voices blending with the wind. A pattern so old and steady that, if you close your eyes, you can almost feel it breathing around you, carrying you forward on the gentle tide of days that stretch endlessly into the grey horizon. As the afternoon edges toward evening, the island monastery begins its slow exhale. The day's work winds down, though here, even labor feels like a soft echo of the prayers that bookend every hour. You find yourself by the small flock of chickens in the sheltered yard, a narrow space ringed by rough stone walls that catch the last warmth of the sinking sun. The hens scratch at the packed earth, pecking for seeds or stray insects, their muted clucks adding a humble music to the hush. Brother Aidan, older than most and bent like a wind-shaped tree, crouches nearby, murmuring to the birds as he gathers the day's precious handful of eggs. He passes you a small basket lined with straw, and together you check each corner for any that might have rolled away into the shadows. The eggs will be stored carefully in a cool corner of the storeroom, saved for the infirmary or for feast days when the monotony of lentils and barley is briefly broken. A single egg can feel like a treasure here, a small gift of protein and comfort. As you lift the basket, you feel its warmth against your chilled palms, a tiny reminder that life, however sparse, persists here in stubborn defiance of the wind and salt. From the yard you follow a narrow path that skirts the vegetable beds. Rows of hardy cabbages, leeks, and onions stand in stiff formation, their leaves rattling in the breeze like pages turning in an invisible book. A young novice tends the beds with a small knife, trimming away wilted leaves, muttering the names of the plants under his breath as if reciting prayers. He glances up as you pass, nods shyly, then returns to his quiet work, earth and devotion entwined in his small, calloused hands. Further on, you pass the small apiary nestled in a sunlit corner, where weathered wooden hives hum with the steady industry of bees. The honey they produce is a rare luxury, dripped onto coarse bread on high feast days, stirred into thin ale for the sick, or offered as barter when a merchant boat dares the rocky approach. You pause a moment, listening to the faint buzz that weaves with the soft shush of the sea beyond the monastery walls. Even the bees seem to understand the rhythm here. Patient, methodical, a constant hum that mirrors the monks' chants drifting through stone corridors. A distant bell tolls, its mellow note floating on the wind that tugs at the edges of your robe. The sound calls you and your brothers to the evening prayer that gathers the day's labors. Thanks the Creator for small mercies, and eases weary minds into the embrace of night. You slip through the cloister's covered walkway, your sandals brushing against flagstones, worn smooth by generations of feet. Along the wall, a few narrow windows catch the last slanting rays of the sun, casting slender beams across the stone floor like bars of gold. Dust motes dance in the light, each one suspended for a moment before drifting back into the shadows. Inside the chapel, the air is warmer than you expect. Oil lamps flicker from small iron hooks, their flames mirrored in the polished surface of the single brass cross that hangs above the rough altar. The brothers gather in silence, finding their places with practiced ease, knees brushing the cold stone floor as they settle into familiar shapes. The chanting begins, low at first, a hesitant murmur that grows into a steady tide of voices. Each note clings to the ancient timbers overhead, echoes from 100 years of prayers stitched into every beam and stone. You join in, your breath misting in the chill, the Latin syllables rolling off your tongue like a well-worn path. Vespers is not hurried. Here there is time enough for every psalm, every verse, every pause that lets the mind drift into the spaces between words. You feel the day's toil ease from your shoulders, carried off by the slow rise and fall of the chant, and the steady comfort of your brothers' voices weaving around you. When the final amen fades, the monks remain kneeling for a moment longer, each man adrift in his own silent prayer. Then, as one, they rise, feet whispering across the stone as they file toward the refectory for the evening meal. Outside, the dusk has deepened. The sky above the cloister glows with the faintest embers of the sun's farewell, streaks of bruised purple and burnished gold slipping behind the sea's wide horizon. A lone gull cries, its voice carried off by the wind that rattles the wooden shutters and finds every crack in the ancient walls. Inside the refectory, the brazier burns brighter now, fed with the day's last scraps of driftwood. Shadows dance across the rough walls, throwing long, flickering silhouettes of bowed heads and folded hands. The benches creak under the weight of weary bodies, settling in for the last nourishment before the night's fast. Tonight's meal is much like any other, a thin pottage of barley and leeks, a heel of bread that must be soaked in broth to be chewed. Now and then, on feast days, or when a merchant's boat brings salt fish or dried apples from the mainland, the meal takes on a fleeting richness that feels almost sinful in its pleasure. But tonight, it is simple and plain. A meal meant to sustain the body just enough to endure the next day's work. At the far end of the hall, Brother Malaki stands at the lectern, reading from the lives of the Desert Fathers, those ancient monks who braved scorching sands and endless solitude in search of a pure heart. His voice is steady but soft, each word a thread weaving through the silence. You listen not for novelty but for comfort. The same stories told again and again, until they become as familiar as your own breath. You break off a piece of bread, dip it into the warm pottage. Savor the salt that clings to your fingers. The flavors are mild, the texture rough, but they carry with them the weight of centuries. Countless monks who sat in these same seats, eating the same humble fare, their minds drifting beyond these walls to the promises of a life yet to come. A draught slips through the hall, ruffling the flame of the brazier and sending a brief shiver through your spine. You pull your robe tighter, shoulders brushing the brother beside you. A small, fleeting touch that reminds you that even in this silence, you are not alone. This, too, is part of the vow. Solitude without loneliness, distance without isolation. A shared quiet that hums just beneath the surface, binding you to these men and this place in ways deeper than any spoken word. When the final scrap of bread is gone and the bowls are cleared, the brothers bow their heads in a final prayer of thanks. The words linger, soft and sure, before dissolving into the steady hush that fills every corner of this place after dark. You stand, knees stiff, back aching from the long day's work. Together, the monks drift toward the cloister walk once more. The air, cool and thick, with the scent of the sea. The lamps sway in the wind, casting shifting shapes on the old walls. Reminders that night here is not an ending but another turning in the wheel of time that rolls ceaselessly over stone and sea alike. One by one, you slip back to your cells. Small, cold rooms that cradle sleep like a shallow bowl holds water. Before you close the heavy door behind you, you pause to look out through the narrow window slit. The sea below is black now, a restless sheet of ink that heaves and sighs against the rocks. Somewhere out there, a ship might be making its slow, treacherous way toward a distant harbor. But here, all is stillness. A world held tight within walls that have weathered 100 storms, and will weather 100 more. You kneel by your straw pallet, whispering the same words you whispered the night before, and the night before that. Outside, the wind hums through the eaves, a lullaby of salt, and he grew older, as all boys do, though the life here folds a soul so gently into its pattern that years pass like water slipping through cupped hands. By the time he was fully professed, Brother Seelan's hair was already dusted with silver at the temples, a sign the older monks liked to say that the sea had lent him its color in exchange for his devotion. But it wasn't only the garden that bore his touch. In the scriptorium he developed a slow, deliberate hand. Not the most elegant, but steady enough to copy worn pages into neat, new volumes that found their way to the mainland in the rare seasons, when the seas were calm enough for traders to come. When a fever swept through the monastery one bitter spring, Brother Seelan worked alongside Brother Aelb through long, sleepless nights. He brewed willow bark tea to soothe aching limbs, laid cool cloths on burning foreheads, whispered psalms in the quiet darkness to ease the trembling fears that came when the world narrowed to a single stone cell and the shadows that gathered in its corners. They say it was Seelan's idea to hollow out the old root cellar, turning it into a crude infirmary, a place where the sick could lie together warmed by a single hearth rather than shivering alone behind cold walls. It was a small thing, but on this island, small mercies mattered. When Brother Aeld passed, his hands wrapped around the worn rosary that had grown slick from decades of prayers, Seelan took up his role not by any formal decree, but because no one else knew the herbs as he did, or had his patience for mixing teas by candlelight, when the wind howled so fiercely outside that the shutters rattled like bones. His days followed the same gentle pattern, prayers before dawn, then hours in the garden, tending rows of stubborn vegetables coaxed from reluctant soil. If the weather turned harsh, he retreated to the infirmary or the scriptorium, his voice a calm counterpoint to the storm's roar, as he read aloud from the worn pages of the saints' lives. Sometimes a trader's boat would arrive, bobbing in the small natural harbor below the island's steep path. The trader would bring sacks of flour, bolts, of course, and news from the mainland. Kings crowned or unseated, new taxes, rumors of war or plague. Seelan would stand a little apart, listening but unmoved. For what difference did distant quarrels make to an island whose stones cared for no crown but the one carved in the chapel, his tiny crucifix? As the years gathered in quiet drifts around him, Brother Seelan's back grew bowed like the apple tree that clung to the leeward side of the garden wall, a tree he had planted himself from a seed given by a passing pilgrim decades earlier. When the sea froze in places one vicious winter, cutting the island off for weeks, it was Seelan who rationed the saltfish, counting out each measure with the same patient hands that once tended seedlings. When storms tore the roof from the scriptorium, scattering pages like startled birds, it was Seelan who gathered them, drying them carefully by the hearth, binding them back together with strips of salvaged vellum. He never sought praise. Indeed, there was no one here to give it, not in any way that would change a life so set in its course. His comfort was the garden beds turn green, again each spring the soft breath of a fevered brother, returning to steadiness, the small bright flash of a bird that landed on the monastery's stone wall, its song sweet against the salt hush of the wind. In the final winter of his life, Brother Seelan took to sleeping in the infirmary, too frail now to climb the steps back to his cell each night. The brothers kept the fire stoked, though driftwood was scarce. They would find him in the mornings sitting by the low hearth, rosary in hand, eyes fixed on the flicker of flame that danced against the blackened stones. When he passed, there was no grand procession, only the steady rhythm of prayers, the scraping of shovels in the frozen earth, the quiet sigh of the sea against the rocks below. They buried him in the small cemetery, under the bent apple tree he had coaxed from that single seed. Years later, when storms battered the island and new brothers took the place of old, they spoke of Seelan's gentle touch. His name was scratched into a ledger, but more than that, it lived in the garden beds he shaped, the rough walls of the infirmary that still kept the wind at bay, the faint, sweet scent of dried herbs that lingered in the cracks of the stone. When the wind howls through the cloister now, some say it carries his prayers due soft, steady, woven into the hush of this island that cradled him all his life. Long after Brother Seelan's body returned to the island's rocky soil, his story drifted through the monastery like a soft chant carried on the wind. Not the tale of a saint with miracles carved in marble, but of a simple brother whose small acts of care settled into the very stones. Imagine a young monk, years later, bent over the same garden beds Seelan once coaxed to life. His name might be Brother Finian, his shoulders narrow under the heavy wool of his robe, his hands raw from digging in the stubborn earth. He knows the stories well, for they are not kept locked away in dusty books but passed along in murmured words between hoe and seedling, whispered over steaming bowls of barley. The garden is more than a plot of soil. To these monks, it is Seelan's quiet testament, a place where prayer finds shape in green, shoots pushing up through frost-hardened ground. There is an old, mossy stone near the garden wall, flat and wide enough to sit on. Some say it was Seelan's favorite spot, where he would rest his aching knees after hours of tending the herbs. Even now a young novice might pause there a brief rest between chores, closing his eyes to feel the sun on his face, and imagine the gentle hum of Seelan's voice, offering a prayer for tender leaves and strong roots. In their scriptorium, too, his memory lingers. The old oak desk he once leaned over still stands by the window where the afternoon light pools when the weather is kind. Its surface is scarred with tiny cuts and ink stains, the marks of steady, patient labor that outlasts any single hand. Sometimes a brother copying a fragile manuscript will run a finger over those faint scratches, a tactile reminder that a single life, unremarkable by the world's reckoning, can anchor generations in its quiet devotion. The brothers say it was Seelan who started the practice of keeping small bundles of dried herbs in the corners of the scriptorium, sprigs of lavender and rosemary tucked between shelves, their gentle scent mixing with the musty perfume of old parchment. Even now, when a quill catches or a line must be erased and re-inked, that soft fragrance steadies a monk's breath, reminding him that care is not wasted even on tasks that seem to vanish like footprints on the shore. His touch lives on in the infirmary as well, the low hearth that still burns when winter storms lash the island. The shelves lined with simple jars of dried yarrow, comfrey, and willow bark. Brothers who tend the sick remember the stories of how Seelan gathered herbs from the cliff edges when the gardener's yield was thin, braving the sharp winds and slick rocks to bring back green life where there might have been none. In the long nights when a fevered brother murmurs in half-waking dreams, the infirmarian still brews the same bitter tea Seelan once mixed, reciting a line of a psalm with each measured stir. There is comfort in this repetition, as if the old brother's steady hands reach through the years, cupping the flame against the wind. Sometimes, when the traders come, battered boats pulled into the shallow harbor below the monastery's winding path, the brothers barter small pots of honey, salt, and the occasional bundle of herbs. A curious merchant might ask about the sturdy walls that hold the infirmary's warmth so well, or the apple tree that bends low over the small cemetery plot. And if the monk is inclined, he will tell them of Brother C, how his hands shaped more than just plants and pages, but also the quiet fabric of this place, strong enough to hold back the loneliness that the sea is always ready to spill across the stones. On certain feast days, when the wind softens and the sea glimmers like brushed pewter under the shifting clouds, the brothers gather in the garden after vespers. They carry small baskets of early herbs, the first mint leaves, tender shoots of chive, maybe a handful of wild garlic if they were lucky enough to find it in the cracks of the rocky shore. They set these small offerings beneath the bent apple tree where Seelan rests, not out of superstition, but as a simple sign that life, however hard, still grows here because of hands like his. The gardens, rough beds, the patched roof of the root cellar turned infirmary, the old oak desk in the scriptorium, none are beautiful in the way a grand cathedral might be. They are plain, work-worn, marked by weather and age. But to those who know this island's breath and heartbeat, these things are beautiful all the same, because they hold the memory of a life spent in steady service, each moment stitched into the rhythm of stone and sea. There is an old phrase the brothers whisper to the novices, who come wide-eyed and uncertain, clutching their thin blankets on the first night when the wind moans through the cloister. A man is as lasting as his care. The words are not carved above the chapel door, nor painted in any grand script upon the walls. They live only in these simple stories, in the hush of the refectory after a long day's toil, in the nod of a head toward the garden when the frost lifts just enough to show new green shoots, in the deep dark of night when the last lamp guttered out, and the wind prowls at the corners of the stone cells. A young monk might wake, mind drifting into hut. He might remember the story of Seelan gathering herbs by moonlight when the fevers raged, or picture him kneeling in the garden under a whipping storm, pressing straw around tender seedlings, with hands stiff and cold but patient. And somehow, that memory, half story, half lullaby, carries him back into sleep. The sea murmurs against the rocks, the monastery's walls creak softly under the weight of the wind, and that quiet echo of care, passed from one life to the next, settles over the island like a blanket stitched from centuries of whispered prayers. When dawn comes, the bell will toll again, the same steady summons that Brother Seelan rose to all those years ago. A new set of hands will lift the hoe, mend the broken barrel, stir the bitter tea. The world beyond the sea may change, but here, the small, enduring grace of one gentle life hums on, in the hush, between tides. In a place so bound to the sea, storms are like old visitors, always expected, never fully welcome. Long after Brother Seelan's bones rested beneath the apple tree, the monks learned that the CS mercy could turn thin as parchment. When winter esbreath came hard and sharp, they say it was a year when the summer had been stingy, the gardens yield thin, the trader's boat delayed by high tides and rough winds. By November, the barrels of salted fish sat lower than they should have, and the sacks of barley bore the damp smell that warned of rot if left unchecked. The brothers took to eating thinner pottage, smaller hunks of bread, each mindful of the day when the sea might close its iron door and leave them, with only what their hands could coax from the cold ground. The first snow came early, fine, icy flakes that rode the salt wind and sifted into every crack in the cloister walls. By the second week of Advent, the wind turned fierce, driving sleet sideways, rattling the wooden shutters so hard they shivered like frightened birds. Brother Finian, one of the youngest, wrote, years later, that the sea sounded like a living thing, not the gentle hush of waves lapping the rocks, but a raw roar that made the stones themselves seem to hum with warning. Some nights the gusts struck the chapel roof so violently that the brothers huddled in the refectory by the brazier, praying that the timbers worn soft by salt and age would not give way under the battering of the storm. When dawn managed to break through the storm clouds, the courtyard lay crusted in a hard rind of ice. The chicken's small coop drifted over with snow that froze solid and refused to melt. The garden, once a patchwork of hardy greens, had vanished under a crust that gleamed like grey glass. Even the beehives, tucked tight against the stone wall for shelter, sat silent, the bees hidden deep inside in a tight, shivering ball of life clinging to warmth. It was in those bleak mornings when the brothers' breath fogged the air and the last logs burned low in the brazier that they spoke of Seelan again. Not as some saint above mortal worry, but as a brother who knew what it was to count each crumb, to find life in the thin crack of rock where an herb might root. They remembered how he had once shown them to pack straw and seaweed around the base of the garden wall to keep the roots from freezing. So in the icy dawn, the monks shuffled into the courtyard, shoulders hunched against the wind, gathering driftweed torn from the shore by the violent surf. They layered it clumsily along the beds they could reach, even knowing little would sprout before spring. It wasn't the saving of plants that mattered most. It was the act itself, the echo of Seelan's careful hands in their own numbed fingers. When the salt barrels began to run low, the brothers found that the sacks of barley had indeed begun to mold. The smell of damp grain mixed with the musty scent of wool cloaks drying by the hearth. They sorted it by hand, tossing the worst into the courtyard for the chickens who, bewildered by the snow, pecked at the mouldy kernels, if to remind the monks that nothing was wasted if they had the patience to find its use. At night, when the wind rattled the shutters so fiercely that sleep came in broken snatches, Brother Cedric, the oldest now, his hair a thin white fringe, would tell the novices how Seelan once braved a winter not unlike this. He would speak of how the old brother rationed the last of the salted fish, made broth from bones boiled 3 times over, mixed dried seaweed into the pottage when the garden was bare. The young ones, huddled on their straw pallets, would listen with wide, shadowed eyes. In those stories they found not just survival but a kind of tether proof that someone before them had stood at the edge of the world when the sea threatened to swallow the little warmth they held in their cracked hands. One morning, as the storm dragged on into its 3rd week, a gust tore a part of the scriptorium's old roof clean away. bits of soaked thatch scattered across the cloister, ink-stained pages tumbled like frightened birds, drifting into snowdrifts, and across the icy yard. The brothers rushed out, heads bent into the wind, gathering the precious pages against their chests, their breath ragged in the cold. When they brought the dripping manuscripts inside, the brothers huddled in the scriptorium, setting the pages by the hearth in the infirmary, the same low hearth that Selin had built with stones dragged from the shore, when the old root cellar became too damp to store food. As the flames flickered, drying the fragile parchment, they took turns reading the pages aloud, lines of psalms, scraps of the saints' lives, bits of old chronicles that recorded storms just like this one, long ago. The words drifted through the room like a second fire, warming the spaces the brazier could not reach. They say that nigh novice named Ronan woke from a restless sleep and crept out to the infirmary. There he found Brother Cedric, seated in Selin's old place by the hearth, his hand resting on the broad stone Selin had once used as a seat while he mixed his teas and poultices. Cedric's eyes were closed, lips moving in prayer, though whether he prayed for the pages drying near the fire, the garden buried in ice, or the brothers asleep in their cells, Ronan never knew. The storm finally broke with the feast of the Epiphany. Dawn rose pale and cautious, the wind's roar falling back to its familiar hush against the rocks. The brothers stumbled out into the courtyard, boots crunching through frozen drifts that gleamed like a mirror to the dull sky. The chickens emerged first, blinking at the sudden stillness, feathers ruffled like old men shrugging into the morning. By midday, a feeble sun thawed the thin layer of ice on the barrels. The monks gathered around the garden beds, brushing away clumps of crusted snow. Beneath the straw they had packed during those fierce winds and gnarled nights, a few shoots of cabbage still clung to life, limp, pale green, but alive, a small sign that care, however desperate, still bore fruit. That night, the brothers gathered in the refectory, hands wrapped around steaming bowls of pottage made richer with the last scraps of fish. The storm had taken much food, warmth, pages half blurred by melted snow. But they sat together, eyes fixed on the flickering brazier, listening as Cedric told once more of Brother Selin's calm in winters past. They didn't speak of miracles. No storm had parted at his name. No angels had brought food when the barrels ran dry. Instead, they spoke of small, human choices. Hands packing straw around cabbage roots, fish bones boiled 3 times, seaweed pulled from the surf and turned into sustenance. Outside, the seaside against the rocks, restless but spent, its rage given way to the steady hush that always follows. The monastery exhaled too, stones creaking softly as if to release the tension held in each wall and beam. Brother Selin's garden would bloom again when spring came. It always did. Not because of any grand promise written in the stars, but because each generation of monks remembered his simple truth. That care, given freely and without fanfare, could outlast even the fiercest wind. And so the island, wrapped in its salt-sweet hush, drifted on. Its stones, holding tight to a memory of one life that reminded all who came after that, even on the far edge of the known world. A heart steady in small mercies could weather any storm. In the centuries since Brother Selin's passing, the monastery has kept no gilded reliquary, no painted icons to declare him a saint. His bones lie undisturbed beneath the bent apple tree in the small cemetery that leans into the wind at the far end of the garden wall. No pilgrims cross the heaving sea to kneel by his grave, and no miracle has been recorded on the yellowed pages of the scriptorium's ledgers. Yet, in the hush of dawn and the hum of bees in summer, his name persists. It lives not as legend or sermon, but as a gentle breath that drifts through the habits of the monks who followed him. Each spring, when the last of the frost has lifted and the gardenist's rough beds begin to yield to the coaxing of patient hands, the brothers gather by the apple tree. There is no formal service, just a circle of robed figures standing quietly, the wind tugging at their hoods, the damp earth soft beneath their sandals. The gardener, a role never formally given but always understood, kneels first, pressing his palm to the soil near Selin's simple marker. He might murmur a line of scripture or hum some mysteries are little more than practical truths polished by time into something softer, more suggestive. Take the reliquary said to be hidden beneath the chapel's stone floor. An old tale tells how, during the age of Viking raiders, the brothers feared their simple crucifix and rough-hewn altar might be torn down, their meager treasures looted for silver that never existed. So they hid what they had. a shard of bone said to belong to a long-ago martyr whose name no one quite remembers now. The brothers sealed it beneath a slab near the chapel's northern wall, covering the spot with a thin layer of smooth plaster. They made no mark to reveal its presence. Instead, they passed its story in low voices during winter storms, the words weaving through the dormitory like a lullaby that soothed fears of blades and torches crossing the narrow sea. No raiders ever found it, or if they did, they left the bone untouched, perhaps seeing no worth in a splinter so small it could vanish in a palm. Generations later, the relic remains, or so they say. The northern wall bears no sign, just the cold press of stone and the faint smell of damp earth, where salt air creeps under the door. But the novices sometimes kneel a little longer on that side, pressing fingertips to the floor, as if they might feel a heartbeat echoing through the bedrock. The scriptorium, too, hums with secrets. There is an old shelf tucked into the darkest corner, half hidden behind a thick tapestry that smells of tallow smoke and the brine-laden breeze. It holds books too battered to bind anew, pages crumbling, ink blurred by centuries of damp and careless handling. One such volume, its cover gone to powdery flakes, contains what some call the Codex of the Pebble. Its pages tell a story that sounds more legend than gospel. That when the Monastery's founders first landed on the island, they found a single strange stone on the rocky shore, smooth oval, speckled like a bird's egg. They took it as a sign. No one knows why. Perhaps it was simply pretty in the dawn light after a stormy crossing. Perhaps the brothers, weary from weeks on a tossing sea, needed an omen that this bleak rock would cradle them kindly. They built their first hut above the tide line, and tucked the pebble into a shallow niche behind the altar. Generations later, they still claim the pebble remains, though no novice has laid eyes on it. Some say the codex is the pebble itself, that the splotches on its faded pages are stains made when the stone was pressed between parchment leaves like a relic. Others say the real pebble sits inside the locked wooden box that stands watch over the altar. The truth matters less than the hush that clings to the tale, a soft murmur that binds each new brother to the old ones. Who built these walls stone by rough stone? Folklore gathers like sea foam in corners no one thinks to sweep. Take the passageway that runs beneath the cloister walk. It is little more than a cramped crawl space, lined with old barrels and driftwood beams turned black with age. Yet some say that in the deepest part of winter, when the sea roars and the wind screams like a dying animal, a brother can slip down there to hear the voice of the island itself. A low echoing hum that sounds like prayers spoken by the rocks and waves together. Brother Ronan, the one who once found Brother Cedric praying by the hearth during the great storm, claimed he heard it once. He said he lay on the damp earth, cheek pressed to the cold stone, and heard words in no tongue. He knew, a chant older than any psalm, older than the church that sent them here. He never wrote them down. He only told the youngest late at night when the lamps guttered and the sea hissed against the outer walls like a secret trying to slip inside. Then there is the matter of the visitor, always told in the same hushed tone, as if the mere mention might conjure something from the fog that curls around the island at dawn. The story says that every few decades a stranger appears at the tide line, just as the sun breaks the horizon. A figure wrapped in a cloak that seems to drip with seawater, though his feet leave no tracks on the wet stones. He asks for bread and a cup of the brothers' thin ale. He eats in silence while the monks stand at a careful distance, hands hidden in sleeves, eyes lowered so as not to stare. When he finishes, he bows to the chapel door but never enters. Instead, he turns back toward the tide, cloak trailing across the rocks, and vanishes into the mist without a word. No one knows if he's flesh or spirit, a lonely pilgrim or something older, wearing a pilgrim's face. Some say he's a ghost of one of the founders, come to test the monks' charity. Others think he's the island itself, taking human shape to remind the brothers that their hospitality binds them to more than just the rule of their order. It ties them to the old covenant between stone and sea and fragile human hands, trying to hold the two together. Each time the story is told, it shifts a little. Some brothers swear the visitor spoke a single word before stepping into the fog, a word they could not understand, but that tasted of salt and sounded like waves crashing against the outer rocks. A novice might whisper that he saw the footprints once, clear as pressed shells on wet sand, but when he ran to fetch another to witness them, they had vanished in the wash of the incoming tide. Such stories live alongside the daily routine, the chanting in the chapel, the scraping of hose in the garden, the soft sigh of pages turned in the script. They are never written in the official ledgers, never carved into the stone arches that mark the cloister walk. yet they drift from lip to ear like incense smoke, curling through the minds of weary monks who, in the darkest hours of the night, feel the walls lean close, as if they too are listening. When dawn comes, the sea hushes, the stones clean again, washing the footprints from the rocky causeway, rinsing secrets from the salt air, but not from the monks' hearts. There, the stories linger like a low hum beneath the steady chant of prayers, a reminder that this island, this monastery, is more than stone and labor and the predictable turn of the tide. It is a place where the line between the seen and the whispered blurs, where a single pebble or a stranger's silent visit can grow into a legend that outlasts the hands that first told it. A fragment of the same chant Selim would have known, the words lost in the constant hush of the sea. Then, one by one, each monk scatters a handful of composted soil, mixing the old life back into the new. It is a small rite, yet it ties them to him, a reminder that the patient tending of roots and shoots holds its own quiet grace. Inside the scriptorium, the brothers keep another small tradition. On the day after this simple garden blessing, the novice with the steadiest hand is asked to copy a single page of an old text, any passage so long as it speaks of care, mercy, or the endurance of humble work. It might be a parable from the Gospels, a line from the Desert Fathers, or a short poem brought in by a passing trader generations ago. That single page is added to a thin book kept in a rough leather binding. They call it Selim's folio, though it bears no portrait, no title page, no claim to canonize a man who never sought it. Instead, the pages bloom with the spidery handwriting of countless novices who, in those few careful hours, sit at the battered oak desk by the window, the same desk Selim once inked his letters upon by candlelight, while storms beat at the shutters. There are small thumbprints smudged into the parchment, faint spots where a candle's wax dripped, corrections squeezed into the margins when a word was misspelled. Each page is a soft promise that the rhythm of steady, unheralded work remains unbroken. Each letter a small echo of the quill strokes Selim once made, each novice adding his own whisper to the hush of the scriptorium. Beyond these simple gestures, the brothers mark his memory in ways even less formal but perhaps more enduring. In the infirmary, when a monk sits through the long, restless hours beside a sickbed, he stirs the herbal pot just as Selim did. Deliberate turns, each one an unspoken prayer. If the garden's yield is meager, the gardener will speak Selim's name aloud when tucking straw around stubborn roots, not in hope of conjuring a miracle, but to remind himself that even the smallest mercy, a few green leaves saved from the frost, can grow into a story that lasts centuries. In the refectory, when the winter storms threaten and the barley sacks grow light, the brothers might smile at the thought of the old stories how Selim once brewed pottage from driftweed and boiled bones 3 times over. That gentle recollection holds back despair like a warm blanket tucked tight against a bitter draught. Sometimes, when traders come, rough-handed men with weathered faces and salt clinging to their beards, they stand by the low garden wall, warming their palms around a cup of thin ale. They ask about the old brother whose name they heard on the mainland, a man who once healed a fisherman's son with a simple compress of dock leaves and willow bark, or who braved the cliffs to gather herbs when the rest feared to go. The monks do not embellish these tales. They speak of him as he was quiet, steady, never quick to claim credit for the gentle miracles that come from patient hands, and a heart that knows the worth of small mercy. Then the traders move on, sails snapping in the stiff wind as they vanish into the restless hush of the sea. In the novice dormitory, when the wind claws at the shutters, and the sea roars so loud that sleep slips away like a startled bird, an older brother will tell Selim's story once more. He will speak of the boy who came here with nothing but a blanket and grew roots in this salt-crusted rock, of the man who tended fevered brows and coaxed fragile shoots from stubborn soil, of the brother who found the divine not in relics or marble chapels, but in the way a single herb could soothe a cough, or a single word could calm a frightened novice's racing heart. Those words drift into the flickering darkness, settling like a soft benediction on straw mattresses and thin blankets. In the hush that follows, the monastery exhales. Stones creak. The tide whispers to the rocks below. The wind prowls at the eaves but never quite breaks through the patient stillness within. No bell tolls for Brother Selim alone. No feast day bears his name on the calendar tacked to the scriptorium's wall. Yet each time a brother ties his robe tighter against the wind, each time hands brush snow from the garden beds or pack straw around fragile roots, each time a quill scratches a word of hope onto thin parchment, his life hums through it all. In this way, he remains, not as a shadow in the corners of the chapel, but as a pulse in the daily tasks that make this place breathe. Work, prayer, the patient, tending of small things that others might overlook, but which here on this remote island become the foundation for everything that endures. When the brothers rise tomorrow, when the first bell calls them into the hush of matins long before dawn, they will kneel in the same chapel where Seelin once knelt. They will chant the same verses, carry water from the same barrel, mend the same cracked walls. In each motion, his story flows beneath the surface like the tide beneath the rocks, a reminder that even the quietest life can root itself so deeply that not even centuries of wind and salt can wash it away. And when the novices lie awake on stormy nights, they may close their eyes and picture the old brother moving through the cloister, lantern in hand, cloak snapping in the wind as he stoops to gather the herbs that cling stubbornly to the garden wall. They will remember that care given freely, even on the far edge of the known world, echoes on, steady as the sea and soft as a whispered prayer. Segment 3, Part 1, Secrets in Stone and Salt. An island monastery isolation breeds not just silence but secret, half-remembered things that slip between the cracks of stone walls and lodge in the spaces where the wind can't quite reach. Even the youngest novice, eyes wide and heart still tender, senses the hush that settles over certain corners of the cloister. In the long shadows before matins, he might hear a brother mutter an old prayer that doesn't appear in any manuscript, or he might glimpse a small wooden box kept locked behind the altar, its hinges stiff with rust, its purpose never spoken of outright, yet its presence as familiar as the taste of salt on his lips. And so the novices listen, heads bowed against the wind, hearts rooted in the steady hush of stone and salt, waiting perhaps to hear the island's own voice if they press an ear close enough, long enough to the cold, patient ground. Sometimes the wind and sea conspire to reveal what the stone walls would rather keep hidden. A heavy storm will chew away a patch of the courtyard, peeling back moss and soil to show an old carved stone, a rusted tool blade, or a handful of broken pottery the brothers had long forgotten. In these moments the monks gather around the small fire like children around a hearth, heads bent, voices hushed, each man reminded that the earth beneath their sandals is not blank but layered with quiet stories, pressed deep by centuries of feet passing the same worn path. One fragment unearthed in such a storm was little more than a lump of iron, its edges pitted and flaked. But when the gardener, his knees muddy from kneeling over the newly exposed patch, turned it over in his palm, he found a faint cross scratched into the rough surface, so simple, a mark that any mason or novice might have made it. Some said it was an old votive token, tucked into the ground by the founders as they laid the monastery's earliest stones. Others claimed it was part of an old hinge from the chapel door, marked so that even the iron would remember its service to God. The truth, like so many things here, matters less than the hush that gathered around it. The Way brothers lowered their heads, tracing the cross with a thumb before tucking the piece back into the earth, covering it gently with a layer of damp soil, as if returning a blessing to its rest. The cemetery, too, holds secrets beneath its bramble-choked corners. Once, during the clearing of old weeds near the apple tree where Brother Seelin sleeps, a novice's spade struck a slab of stone. Brushing away soil and fine roots revealed the faint outline of letters, a name half erased by the centuries of salt, wind, and rain. No record in the scriptorium mentioned this brother's name. No old ledger told of what life he led or what prayers he murmured as he drifted into the hush of death. Yet for weeks afterward the novices spoke of him in whispers, wondering what task he'd loved best, whether he'd turned soil in the garden, tended the lamps in the chapel, or copied lines by the dim light of a tallow candle until his eyes blurred and his head bowed into sleep. At dusk, some would press their palms to the old stone, rough under their fingertips, the moss damp but strangely warm. It was their quiet way of telling him, "We remember you, though we do not know you." Here where the sea erases so much, a single letter chiseled into crumbling rock can be an anchor stronger than any iron chain. In the scriptorium's far corner, behind shelves that groan under the weight of ledgers and herbals, lies a single brick wall that hums with rumor. No novice has seen what's behind it, and few old brothers speak of it directly, but the tale passes mouth to ear that behind those bricks sealed up when the first scriptorium roof rotted and caved, lies a shallow alcove filled with scraps of parchment, too fragile to save, drafts of psalms, herbal recipes, half-finished letters, to distant abbots that were never sent. It is said that, when the wind blows from the north and the rain beats against the leaded glass, a soft rustle sometimes echoes behind that wall, the whisper of pages that, though buried, still remember the scratch of quill and the hush of candlelight. Some novices, bolder than others, have crept close during stormy nights, pressing an ear to the cold bricks, hoping to catch that papery breath. Whether they truly hear it, or the wind simply weaves its voice through gaps in the stone, hardly matters. In that moment, they are tied not just to the living brothers dozing on their straw pallets, but to the hands that shaped words on fragile vellum long before they themselves drew breath. In the cloister walk, small signs of the past slip beneath the everyday routine. Along the inner wall, there is a single stone that sits slightly crooked in its row. Its surface bears a faint spiral, so worn that in certain light it is little more than a suggestion. A swell that might be moss, might be lichen, but which the oldest brothers insist is deliberate. They say the spiral was carved by the first stonemasons, a humble echo of the older faith that clung to these remote shores before the monastery's founders set foot here, a symbol of the endless cycle. Tide and wind, prayer and work, birth and returning to the earth. Some novices reach out to touch it when the weight of silence grows heavy, tracing the groove as if to remind themselves that they, too, are part of something looping and unbroken. However small their parts might seem, even the bell rope bears its hidden tale. Each morning before matins, a brother pulls the thick hemp line that runs up into the dark throat of the bell tower. If he looks closely, he will see, near the base, a simple knot bound, tight, and darkened by sweat and oil from countless hands. The story goes that the knot marks a promise made by the brothers during a siege centuries ago, when raiders threatened to cut them off from the mainland for good. They tied the rope as a vow. So long as this knot remains, the bell will ring to call us back, no matter how fierce the wind. Each generation tightens the knot, pulls it taut with a new prayer, a pledge that, though the stones may crack and the sea may roar, the bell will keep summoning them to stand shoulder to shoulder in the hush before dawn. It is this subtle layering of the hidden and half-seen that binds the monks to their home more tightly than any iron clasp. A scrap of old pottery turned up in a cabbage bed, a swirl on a cloister stone, the whisper of lost pages behind a brick wall. Each piece anchors them, roots them, in the knowledge that their days are not drifting out to sea, but folded into a long, quiet memory that cradles them like the tide cradles the rocks. When the wind rises, and it always does, rattling the wooden shutters and setting the chapel's old beams creaking, these small mysteries drift through the brothers' minds like lullabies. They remind the weary gardener, the stiff-kneed scribe, the novice half asleep on his straw pallet that their work, however small, joins the soft chorus of all those who came before. And when they kneel together at matins, heads bowed, voices weaving a chant that hums through the cold air and into the stones, they know the secrets do not belong to any single brother. They belong to the island, to its restless hush, its stubborn green shoots pushing through the salt-crusted earth, its rocks that bear each chisel mark, each prayer, each whispered story like a song that never ends. A world that demands so little noise, a hidden story becomes a kind of company. For the monks of this salt-battered island, the scraps of mystery buried under mossy stones or sealed behind brick walls are not grand secrets meant to change the course of kingdoms. They are small, persistent echoes that bind each brother to a line of lives stretching back beyond memory. Take the young novices, new to these walls. On their first nights, the wind rattles their thin shutters so fiercely that they pull blankets tight around trembling shoulders, hearts thudding in the hush. Somewhere down the corridor, an older brother will stir on his straw pallet, hearing the restless shifting through the walls. In the morning, when the novices shuffle into the refectory, eyes bruised from half-sleep, the older brother might lean close as the novices break their coarse bread and murmur a fragment of an old tale. Did you know, he might say softly, that the spiral on the cloister stone is older than this roof? Touch it tonight. When you cannot sleep, let the hush remind you, you are not the first to lie awake here. And so the novices learn to braid the past into their days. One might pause as he scrapes turnips in the garden, knuckles raw from the cold, and look to the patch of earth where Brother Seelin, as apple tree, still bends its boughs into the wind. Another might slip into the scriptorium after none tracing his fingertip over the rough bricks that hum with the ghost of lost pages, imagining each word written and buried like a seed waiting for the right season to bloom again. It does not matter if these secrets are ever solved. They are not puzzles to be pieced together, but companions that make each clump of frozen soil or each clattering rainstorm feel less like isolation and more like communion. Even the mundane tasks hum with this hush, A brother sent to shore up the old salt shed after a week of driving rain might pause with a hammer in his hand, his breath frosting the air, and notice a tiny symbol carved into the lintel, a half-faded mark he's seen before, tucked into the corner of a page in the Codex of the Pebble. He will stand there, shoulders stiff under his robe, and for a moment he will feel not alone in the wind, but rooted in a line of careful hands, each one leaving a sign that whispers, "We were here. We watched the tide and the sky just as you do now." This sense of soft continuity becomes a bomb when the storms drag on, and the barrels run low. In those thin seasons, the older brothers gather the novices near the brazier in the refectory and tell them how a hinge with a scratched cross once turned up under the garden beds, or how a chipped bowl was found tucked behind the altar, a bowl that, when filled with rainwater, shone so bright under the morning sun that they took it for a sign that Brother Seelin Esker still watched over them. No one expects these tailies to make the wind blow softer or the cabbages grow taller. Instead, they steady the hands that mend torn robes by candlelight, the minds that recite prayers when words feel heavy and half-meaningless. They are proof that the hush that wraps the island is not emptiness, but a kind of patient witness, a silent nod from the past to the present that work done in faith, however small, does not vanish. When a monk copies pages in the scriptorium, the scratch of his quill merges with the low drone of the wind at the window. He pauses sometimes to warm his fingers over a stub of tallow candle, eyes drifting to the crooked shelf where the oldest volumes sag. Somewhere beneath that wood, the brick wall with its hidden scraps waits, unseen but felt. He does not pry. The mystery is not meant to be solved, but carried like a pebble in a pocket that reminds him, with each step, of the path under his feet. In the garden, a brother might rest his hoe on his shoulder, wiping sweat from his brow with the corner of his sleeve. He catches sight of the old votive iron cross buried again under the soil. He knows it is still there. A promise pressed into the earth that even when the wind scours the island bare, something small and steady will cling to life. It is this sense of quiet guardianship that weaves into their prayers at night. As the first bell tolls in the darkness before dawn, the brothers gather shoulder to shoulder in the chapel, robes brushing the cold floor. Their chants rise and fall, unhurried, each word brushing against stone that has absorbed the same verses for centuries. Somewhere beneath their knees the shard of bone sealed under the northern wall, if it exists at all, holds its own silence, a relic of a relic, a fragment that binds each whispered amen to the fragile bodies that kneel above it. The hushes in the threshold of the chapel door, in the spiral on the cloister wall, in the single knot bound tight in the bell rope. When the wind howls, rattling shutters, and tugging at the eaves, the monks draw these small signs around themselves. Like a blanket, they do not look for answers. They do not demand that secrets yield to torchlight and quill. They only listen for the hum beneath the storm, the murmur that says, "You are not alone." Others have stood in this wind. Others have sung this psalm with chapped lips and numb fingers. Even in sleep, these mysteries drift like low tide around their straw pallets. A novice half wakes to the sigh of waves battering the rocks below and wonders if the visitor, cloaked in sea spray, has stepped again from the tide. He pictures footprints left in the sand, washed clean before the dawn bell rings. He pulls his blanket closer, heart soothed by the thought that the line between now and then, flesh and spirit, known and unknown, has always been porous here. When spring comes, as it always does, the brothers press seeds into the thawing earth with hands that remember every story. The hidden relic, the ghostly pages, the pebble that may or may not sit behind the altar. They plant not just cabbages and onions, but also the knowledge that they are tending a garden layered with soft, human faith, each root tangled with the hush of generations who believe that care given quietly and without hope of fame might one day be unearthed like a blessing returned by the sea. In this way, mystery becomes as real as the salt in the wind or the chant in the chapel at dawn. It lingers in the calloused palm pressed to the spiral in the cloister wall in the hush behind, the brick that holds the ghost of lost pages in the low lullaby of the sea that drifts through cracked shutters when the storms blow cold. It tells each monk that his life, however small, however solitary on this speck of rock in the endless water, is part of something wide and soft and old, a story that hums on in the hush long after the last demand fades into the salt air. In the hush that drifts through these thick stone walls, the line between legend and daily life blurs until each brother carries his share of the monastery. As folklore in the same way, he carries his tools, his quill, his worn beads of prayer. No story is held apart as a relic to be displayed. It is stitched into the simplest moments, a whisper that weaves each monk, breath into the hum of the sea and the creak of ancient timbers overhead. When storms lash the island, as they always do, fierce and sudden, the brothers gather in the refectory by the low brazier. Their robes smell of wet wool and salt air. The novices huddle closer to the older monks, their shoulders brushing in the flickering light. It is in these nights, when the wind claws at the shutters, and the sea roars as if it might swallow stone and man alike, that the old stories breathe the warmest. Brother Sidre, hair gaunt and downy white now, is always the first to speak, his voice a soft scrape beneath the hiss of the wind. He tells again of the crooked spiral carved into the cloister wall, how its curl matches the unseen eddy of the sea just beyond the rocks. He says, though he smiles when he does, that the island's soul spins in that spiral patient and unbroken, reminding each man that what seems endless isolation is instead a circle that returns him to brothers in stone and prayer. Across the flickering brazier, a novice named Cormac listens with wide eyes. He glances at the window, imagining the stone spiral turned sideways in the swirling tide, the sea's hidden heartbeat echoing in the hush that settles after the storm's rage. The story slips into his bones, a lullaby strong enough to soothe the cold ache of doubt that sometimes creeps in when the nights grow long and the barrels run low. Come spring, when the sea grows kinder, and the garden's first shoots push bravely through the thawed beds, the brothers know these stories live not just in words but in gestures, small, repeated like beads on a rosary. They speak Brother Seelan's name aloud when they press straw around fragile roots, not to summon miracles, but to remember that care, even in the smallest acts, binds a man to the breath of the earth and the hush of the tide. There are moments, too, when the mystery feels closer than the garden wall. A trader might arrive at the tide line, his boat riding the gentle push of an early summer wind. He carries coarse sacks of flour and a few bundles of tallow candles, but he carries stories, too, fragments from the mainland, rumors of kings whose scheme of cities where stone towers pierced the sky of relics so gilded. The brothers listened, nodding, their expressions mild. When the trader departs with a jar of honey or a wedge of dried fish packed in salt, the monks return to their cloister, their thoughts untroubled by gold or marble. They have their spiral, their hidden pebble, the hush that lives behind the scriptorium's brick wall. These are relics of a different sort, no less holy for their simplicity, no less enduring for being almost invisible. Sometimes, during the deepest hours of the night, a brother wakes to the sound of rain tapping the roof like fingertips drumming a prayer on stone. He might slip from his cell, bare feet soft on cold flagstones, and step into the cloister wall. There, he pauses by the crooked stone, with its spiral, or stands beneath the bell tower where the rope knot hums its old promise. He does not expect revelation, only the comfort of remembering he is part of something larger than his own quiet breath. If he's bold enough, he might creep to the scriptorium door, lay his palm against the rough brick that seals the forgotten pages. He can almost hear them. The whisper of quills, the crackle of candle wicks, the sigh of a brother who once scratched out the same words under the same soft drone of wind through the rafters. In that moment, the hidden and unknown fold together like waves meeting the shore. Such moments are never spoken of aloud at matins, or in the they slip instead into the soft glances passed between brothers as they tend the garden beds, or scrape salt from the shore rocks at low tide. They breathe through the smallest kindness, the novice who leaves his extra scrap of bread for another, the elder who covers a sleeping brother with his own thin blanket, when the wind steals through the cell walls. When a monk dies, his body laid gently into the shallow earth of the small cemetery, the brothers do not build monuments. They mark the place with a simple cross, perhaps a stone gathered from the shore, polished smooth by centuries of tide. They trust the island to remember him, the hush of the sea, the moss on the chapel walls, the soft footfall of novices passing by in the hush before dawn. Each death folds a new layer into the monastery's secret memory, and each generation picks up the thread without fanfare, a small promise that the hush will hold them, too, when their hands grow stiff and their eyes dim under the salt wind. In this way, the folklore that hums through these stones becomes less a matter of ghost stories than a living bond. It softens the edge of loneliness on nights when the wind roars like a beast outside the walls. It reminds each brother that the spiral on the cloister stone is not just old carving but a sign. What feels like drifting solitude is really part of a wide, gentle circle that will always bring him back to his brothers. to the garden, to the chant that hums through cold air before the first rays of dawn. So when you imagine them now, these monks, these soft keepers of hidden things, see them not as prisoners on a rock, but as quiet stewards of the hush. See them kneeling shoulder to shoulder in the chapel, the candlelight flickering across their bowed heads, their voices weaving words older than any storm. See them pressing seeds into stubborn soil, each shoot cradled by the memory of hands that tended the same patch of earth 100 winters past. And when the sea sighs against the rocks, carrying the stories away into the dark, know that the island will hold them. The spiral on stone, the pebble tucked behind the altar, the hush behind the bricks that hums like the sea itself. It is all part of the same quiet promise that every life, however small, will be gathered into the circle and carried forward on the tide. Segment 4, Part 1, Whispers of Lords and Kings. The island, Monastery, may seem a world apart, wrapped in salt hush, its stones pressed tight against the restless sea. Yet even here, the long fingers of wealth and power sometimes stretch across the water, brushing the cloister with whispers of crowns and crests in distant halls filled with silk and candlelight. Picture, for a moment, a clear day in late summer when the sea lies calm, the waves lapping the rocks like a creature half. In the far distance, a boat appears, its single sail pale against the horizon. The monks gather along the path that snakes down to the cove, their sandals brushing gravel, robes snapping gently in the breeze. They stand at a respectful distance, heads bent, while the boat pulls close enough for them to see the glint of a fine clasp on the cloak of the man who stands at its bow. He is no trader, no rough-handed fisherman hauling sacks of grain or salt. His boots are stitched into finer leather for that. His gloves, when he removes them, are pale, kid-skinned, soft as butter. The monks know enough to keep their eyes lowered, yet they cannot help but glance at the ring that catches the sun on his finger. A signet carved with a hound, as head a crest of a family whose name has weight far beyond the monastery's crumbling ledgers. This man, this visiting lord, or his steward, does not come often, perhaps once every few years, when the tides and the tangle of courtly affairs allow it. He steps onto the shore, the salt air tugging at the hem of his fine cloak, and the wind ever curious slips through the heavy braid of his hair, carrying with it the scent of spices and horses and hearths far warmer than the monk's flickering brazier. For a moment the cloister feels very small, its rough stone and thatched sheds made humbler still beside the weight of what this visitor represents. The wide lands beyond the sea, the bustling manors, the long halls, where voices echo under painted beams, and minstrels pluck harp strings well into the night. Yet the Lord does not come to stay. He comes to witness. He comes to remind the brothers that this lonely outpost is not entirely free from the world's hunger and ambition. Perhaps he comes to confirm that the fish they send for Lent truly reach the kitchens of the manor, or to see that the small rents paid in beeswax and salt are worth the trouble of defending this stone huddle from pirates or rival lords. And sometimes, though only in good seasons, he comes bearing gifts in return. A bolt of coarse cloth to patch robes grown threadbare from wind and work. A single roll of parchment for the scriptorium, its creamy surface, so fine that the novices marvel at it in the candlelight, fingers trembling at its smoothness. The monk's bow as the Lord's steward passeth, the small chest to the prior. There is no flourish. The words exchanged are simple, formal, a prayer offered in return for the cloth, a promise of continued prayers for the Lord's house, for his kin and heirs, for his barns and cattle, for his soul to be guided gently through the storms that even gold cannot calm. Sometimes the Lord lingers in the chapel, standing stiffly beneath the simple crucifix. His eyes sweep the rough benches, the worn stone floor, the flickering lamps, whose flames bow and flutter in the breeze that seeps through the window slits. It is not the splendor he knows. No carved marble saints, no golden candlesticks, no jeweled reliquaries. Here the hush is plain, the wood old and cracked, the air carrying only the faint smell of tallow and damp stone. Yet perhaps he feels something here that the stone pillars of his manor chapel cannot give him. A hush that asks nothing of him but to kneel and be small for a moment, to listen to the chant that drifts like low tide through the thick walls. A quiet not bought by taxes or by tribute, but built up day by day, prayer by prayer, like a wall of breath holding back the restless sea. When he departs, the monks return to their rhythm, as if he were a wind passing through an open door. The bolt of cloth is cut with slow care, It's precious, yards stretched over months to patch elbows, mend fraying hems, bind together scraps of sacking that line the rough mattresses in the novice's dormitory. The parchment is rationed like spring water in a drought, each line of ink pressed so thin that the scriber's eyes burn in the candlelight, and all the while, the sea takes back the hush, rolling over the causeway, erasing footprints that smelled faintly of horse and far-off fires. It is not always lords who come, sometimes it is their emissaries, solemn-faced men with thin ledgers, and the faint smell of stale wine on their breath. They sit at the rough table in the refectory, scratching figures with goose quills, tallying barrels of saltfish, counting the hives whose honey pays tribute in jars sealed with pale wax. The monks, patient as ever, answer questions softly, hands folded in wide sleeves. They know the balance, the protection the Lord's banner promises, should pirates dare the rocky harbor, is worth a handful of hives and salted barrels that leave the island each season. What is honey to them when they have prayers sweeter still, and fish when they eat so little anyway? Sometimes, a thing spoken of only when the wind howls so loud that the walls seem to lean in to listen. A noble-less generosity is not so generous after all. A steward demands more honey than the hives can bear, or salt scraped from rocks, even when storms churn the sea to froth. The brothers obey, bending like the garden's cabbage leaves under heavy rain, trusting that the hush of the chapel will ease what the Lord's hunger takes. Yet even in these moments, they hold to their own wealth. A story half-legend says that during a year when a greedy baron men demanded so much honey that the hives were left bare for winter, the brothers planted row upon row of lavender in the garden's sheltered corner. They called it Celine's Corner, a gentle rebellion hidden in the scent of summer. Blooms the bees returned, the honey returned, and the brothers murmured that some mercies once given grow back no matter how often they are harvested away. The novices repeat this story when they gather herbs by the cloister wall, fingers sticky with sap. They speak it in the scriptorium as they copy Dolan charters into the ledgers. The words a soft shield against the ink-stiff pages that remind them that even here, the world of lords and counts presses its weight through every door latch and storeroom lock. But when dusk drifts down and the bell calls them back to the chapel, the parchment is folded away, the scraps of coin and measure tucked back into the steward's purse. The chant begins again, the same low tide of words that slips beneath fine boots and coarse sandals alike. Here, under the flicker of tallow flame, a lord's signet ring means nothing, and novices' raw hands mean everything. In this way, the hush remains sovereign, a kingdom that the sea holds close, that the wind tests but never takes. The island watchers each visitor come and go, their sails a pale flash on the horizon, their gifts and demands just another tide that rises and recedes. The stone walls stand patient, the garden beds breathe out their green shoots in spring. The brothers lift their voices in the hush before dawn, and the hush, the true wealth of this place, hums on, richer than any chest sealed with crests and wax. For most days, the monastery's hush holds steady, a quiet so woven into the rhythm of work and prayer that even the clatter of a dropped bowl in the refectory sounds like a shout. But once in a while, the silence lifts just enough to make room for laughter, for sweetness, for the warmth of faces turned toward one another instead of bowed over beds of frost-hardened soil. A feast day on this remote rock is no grand affair, no echo of the manor halls where noble guests feast for hours under banners of velvet and gold. Here, the celebration is humble, shaped by the same patient hands that mend robes and stir thin pottage on cold mornings. Imagine the vigil the night before. The brothers gathered in the chapel for long prayers that stretch into the darkness, until candles burn low and the sea hums, like a sleeping giant beyond the thick walls. They kneel shoulder to shoulder on the cold stones, whispering psalms of gratitude for the saint they honor, for the soil that bore what little they have to share, and for the tide that did not swallow their boats when storms came. When dawn finally breaks, gray and soft as wool, the air hums with a gentle anticipation. The novices scurry down the cloister walk with baskets in hand, humble treasures gathered for weeks in preparation. A few eggs from the chickens, saved from daily meals, so that they might be cracked into the batter for small, a handful of dried berries traded with a fisherman whose nets were kinder this season than the last, a pinch of honey, golden and sharp on the tongue, hidden away in a clay pot from the hives nestled against the garden wall. The refectory, so plain on any other day, feels almost warm under the low, flickering glow of extra candles. The tables are scrubbed smooth, their scars softened by the sweet scent of bread baking on the hearth. It is coarse bread still, made from rough ground barley and oats, but today it is flavored with herbs from the small plot of mint and rosemary that clings to life in a sunlit corner of the cloister garden. Before the meal begins, they gather again in the chapel, robes brushing one another like reeds in a marsh. The chant rises brighter this time, less a plea for endurance, and more a song of thanks. The old stories say that Brother Seelan once sang louder on feast days, his cracked voice drifting above the others, a thin but certain thread that reminded every weary soul that even the harshest soil can offer sweetness when tended with care. When the final amen fades into the flicker of tallow flames, the brothers filed back to the refectory. They sit closer than usual, shoulders pressing together, the hush soft but not stifling. A novice stands at the end of the table, reading a passage from an old psalter, one that speaks of fields yielding fruit, of flocks multiplying, of blessings spread like soft rain. The words drift like warm smoke through the hall, twining with the scent of fresh bread and the faint sweetness of stewed apples brought by a kind trader on his last visit. A spoon scrapes the bottom of a small crock, a precious pot of creamy butter, churned weeks ago from the single goat that still browses the wiry grass near the south wall. The novices spread it with careful fingers, each bite a richness that makes their eyes close, if only for a moment. A soft murmur rises now and then, no raucous talk, but simple thanks. For the taste of honey on stale bread, for the small gift of an extra scrap of fish salted and tucked into the stew. The older brothers smile into their bowls, remembering other feasts in winters gone by, each one stitched into the hush like beads on a string. Sometimes, on these days, they remember those who can no longer join the meal. The brothers buried beneath the apple tree in the cemetery, their names fading on rough crosses weathered by salt and time. A bowl of bread and a dipper of ale are set aside, placed on a small wooden shelf near the refectory door, not because they believe the dead will return to eat, but because the gesture itself binds the living to the hush that holds every whispered prayer, every calloused hand, every crumb shared between souls. After the meal, the brothers slip into smaller tasks. A few to the garden to check the cabbage rows, a few to the scriptorium where the precious parchment, gifted by a distant lord, waits for a steady hand and a sharp quill. But the day moves slower. The wind outside feels less like a knife and more like a rough blessing. Laughter drifts from the cloister walk, where two novices share a joke about the chickens scratching at the garden wall. The sound is brief, but it lingers, warming the corners of stone that so often hold only the sea's echo. In the late afternoon, they gather once more. A pot of thin ale, brewed from barley scraps and rainwater, is passed around the cloister. Each man takes just enough to wet his lips, the sour taste sharp but welcome after months of plain water. They stand in a loose circle, the wind tugging at their robes, the scent of earth and salt mingling with the faint sweetness of the mint patch nearby. Brother Cedric, with his voice soft as worn linen, might share a memory of Brother C. How he once insisted on planting a small patch of herbs behind the salt shed because these small intrusions from the wider world never disrupt the island's patient hush for long. The footprints are soon erased by the salt wind and the soft lap of waves on rock. The visitors slip back to the mainland's restless roads, leaving behind only a faint echo. A bowl once held, a blanket now draped across a novice's shoulders on a cold night. When the next storm rises, the brothers gather these stories like driftwood, feeding the low fires that keep the dormitory warm. A novice might ask Brother Cedric about the beads of amber. Cedric will smile into the flickering glow and say that mercy sometimes arrives on broken waves, that what washes ashore is not always ruin. But, reminder, a life carried by the tide can remind a man who thinks himself alone that the hush is wide enough to hold all who find it. Sometimes in the hush of matins a brother kneels in the chapel and feels the ghost of these visitors in the shadows beside him. The fisherman with his salt-rough hands, the pilgrim, clutching a single seashell, the merchant's dying whisper folded into the hush that hums beneath the stone floor. None remain in the ledgers, none are painted on the chapel wall, but their stories settle into the monastery as breath like sand settles into rock crevices along the shore. And when the bell tolls for Compline calling the brothers to their final prayer, before the dark sea sighs them into sleep, they know they keep a vigil not just for themselves but for all those who have brushed against this island. Hush carried back by the restless, tied to places where the wind does not know their names. Outside, the waves tap the rocks in their endless rhythm. The footsteps fade from the path that curls up from the cove. The hush closes around the monastery once more, as soft and patient as the tide itself, waiting, always, to gather whatever the sea might choose to carry home next. When the monks stand at the edge of the path that winds down to the rocky cove, they can see the line where the sea ends and the sky begins. On clear days, that line feels like a promise, a bright thread that hints at towns bustling with market stalls, noble halls heavy with candlelight and song, families gathered tight around warm hearths when the frost sets in. But for the brothers here, the line is also a threshold, a reminder that the hush they tend is not meant to stretch beyond the tide. Their kingdom is bounded by salt and stone and the soft scrape of sandals on worn flagstones. Beyond that lies a world that moves too fast for their slow, measured prayers. They speak of this often, but only in the gentle hush of the cloister walk or in the warmth of the refectory brazier when the wind shrieks at the shutters. Brother Cedric might nod toward the ledgers stacked in the scriptorium, parchment filled with neat, cramped script tracking the rents paid in honey and salt, the traders' boats that came and went, the occasional mark of a noble's seal. He tells the novices that these lines remind them they are not entirely adrift, that the monastery stands because some faraway lord finds it useful to have prayers offered for his soul in a place so lonely that even the devil might hesitate to make the crossing, that the barrels of salted fish and candles of bees that leave this island are a thin rope binding them to a world that forgets them as soon as the sea closes behind the boat. Yet for all these ties, there is freedom in the distance. The hush offers what no banner or coat of arms can buy, a soft certainty that within these thick walls, a man can bend his back to the garden rose or scratch a quill across brittle parchment and feel the weight of the mainland. Hungers slip from his shoulders like a discarded cloak. When the traders come, they bring coins that clink like birdsong in the novices' hands. Bright reminders that somewhere, someone counts profit and debt and measures these brothers can barely grasp. The coins vanish quickly into small repairs, a new roof tile, a blade for the rusting hoe, a sack of flour when the gardens yield sours under cold rain. But once the traders' sail dips beneath the horizon, the coins become less real than the hush that settles in their absence. A novice scrubbing the refectory floor on his knees might pause to wonder what it would be like to walk the mainland's crooked roads, to see cities where bells ring for every hour, where the market stalls, grown with fruit so ripe it bruises under a thumb. He might imagine the press of bodies, the warmth of voices, the quick, easy chatter that flows like a river through crowded squares. But even as he wonders, he feels the hush at his shoulders. The slow, steady breath of the monastery that tells him the sea is not a wall but a kind of mercy, a wide moat that keeps the world's clamor at bay so that a man's own heartbeat can stand alone, unbroken by the noise. This sense of separateness does not breed scorn for the world beyond the tide. The brothers pray for the lords who levy taxes they can barely meet, for the traders who risk storms to ferry small gifts to their battered dock, for the families who light candles in faraway churches hoping their coin reaches this wind-bitten place to buy prayers for the souls of their beloved dead. It is a thread, fragile but real, woven through their daily labors. When they mend the chicken coop, they think of the eggs gathered for the steward's table in a distant manor. When they scrape salt from the shore rocks, they know each grain might one day flavor a noble's feast. Even the bees buzzing in the garden's sheltered corner hum a song that drifts across the waves in the form of wax seals pressed onto letters. Amber candles flickering in chapels where the hush is a stranger. Yet when dusk comes, and the sea swallows the sun in its endless mouth, the brothers return to their true kingdom. They stand shoulder to shoulder in the chapel, robes brushing in the hush, their chant drifting through rafters blackened by centuries of tallow smoke and salt-laden storms. Outside these walls, kingdoms rise and crumble, crests are carved and ground away, banners hang bright and fade to tatters. But within this hush, the rhythm remains, as constant as the tide that claws the rocks below. When pilgrims come, they bring glimpses of that wide world with them. They speak of new taxes that weigh down the backs of tenant farmers, of rumors that the king's youngest son said, "Even the sea needs a bit of sweetness to remember we're not its prisoners." The novices laugh, not because the story is new, but because its familiarity feels like a rope tying them to the men who came before, men who stood here in rough sandals, tasting the same salt air. When dusk creeps across the island, the brothers file back to the chapel for Compline, the final prayer that closes the circle of the day. Their bellies are not full in the way a noble's table would leave them, but they are warm from the bread, the stew, the small sharp sweetness of honey. Their voices rise in the hush, steady, sure, each note wrapping around the cold stone walls like a soft cloak. Outside, The tide creeps up the rocks, washing the footprints from the path that runs to the cove. The wind slips under the doors and rattles the shutters. But tonight, it carries the echo of soft laughter, the warmth of a meal shared, the quiet promise that, even here on a lonely speck of stone, the hush has room for sweetness. When the last amen fades, the brothers drift back to their cells, the novices slower now, lingering to look at the stars pushing through the ragged cloud cover. They stand at the cloister wall, breath misting in the cold, listening to the sea hush against the rocks. Somewhere, in the garden, the mint patch trembles in the breeze, a faint scent of green sweetness carried on the salt air like a whispered reminder. Even the harshest places can bloom for those who tend them gently. And so the feast day passes into memory, folded into the hush that wades behind every rough stone, every humble meal, every prayer hummed through the dark. Tomorrow the rhythm will return. The scraping of hoes in rocky soil, the low chant in the chapel before dawn. But tonight, the hush holds the warmth close, a promise that the island, for all its salt and storms, is more than solitude. It is fellowship, stitched together one shared crumb at a time. Most days, the island sits like a grey stone in a silver sea, too far from the mainland's noisy chatter, too stubborn in its solitude for many to bother with its rocky paths and salt-bitten walls. But every now and then, the tide or the wind decides otherwise, and someone, unlooked for, steps ashore. Sometimes it's a fisherman blown off course by a sudden squall. The brothers spot his small boat first, bobbing like a cork in the swells below the high path. They gather at the edge, robes pressed tight around them, sandals braced against the slick stones. The fisherman's arms wave wildly, or lost or splintered, hair plastered to his forehead by salt spray. When he finally staggers onto the pebbled shore, he's half-starved, shivering, one boot gone to the sea's greedy mouth. The monks take him in with the same hush they give to all things. They lead him to the refectory, wrap him in a rough wool blanket, press a steaming cup of thin ale into his trembling hands. He eats what they can spare, barley broth, stale bread, soaked in warm milk. He sleeps that night in a corner of the infirmary, the low hearth crackling with driftwood scavenged weeks before. When he wakes, his voice is a hoarse rasp, but his eyes are steady again. Anchored by the sight of brothers kneeling in prayer beside his pallet, he does not stay. Once the storm has passed and the sea lies calm as pewter once more, they help him patch his battered boat. They bless his bow with the same soft chant they used to bless the garden beds, and when the tide is right, they push him back into the vast hush beyond the rocks. He glances back once, raising a hand to the black-robed figures watching from the path. The sea folds him into its grey arms, and the monastery sighs back into its familiar stillness. Other visitors drift ashore less by chance than by a longing they cannot name. Now and then, a pilgrim appears, drawn by stories half-whispered in taverns on the mainland. They come not for relics, for the monastery has no gilded bones or jeweled chalices to offer. They come for the hush itself. The promise that, in this salt-bitten place, a soul might stand still long enough to feel its own heartbeat echo against the tide. These pilgrims arrive poorly prepared for the wind's sharp teeth, cloaks too thin, boots worn through. They climb the path to the cloister, breathless from the steep incline and the weight of whatever sign or sorrow they've carried across the choppy water. The monks greet them with the same quiet hands that mend torn robes and bind garden stakes against the wind. They do not ask what burden brought the stranger here. Instead, they offer a place by the refectory hearth, a bowl of broth, a straw mattress in the novices' dormitory. The pilgrim wakes to the bell before dawn, joins the line of bowed heads in the chapel, feels his voice slip into the slow tide of chant that rolls beneath the ancient beams. He might stay a day, or 3, or a week, if the sea turns restless and the small boats cannot safely make the crossing. Some leave behind tokens, not coins or gifts of silver, but softer treasures, a scrap of parchment with a prayer inked in a trembling hand, a seashell tucked onto the chapel's rough altar, so small it could be lost in a single wave. These tiny offerings sit unnoticed by the world, but the brothers know each by heart. The shell, they say, was left by a widow who crossed alone to pray for her son lost at sea. The scrap of parchment was a vow from a soldier whose hands could no longer hold a sword but still trembled in the hush before dawn. And there are arrivals not carried by purpose, but by the raw chaos of wind and water. Once long ago, they say, a merchant's ship foundered against the rocks that guard the island's shallow curve. He washed up half-drowned, cloak torn 2 ribbons, boots heavy with salt. When the brothers dragged him from the foam, he gasped out words in a tongue they did not know, clutching a leather pouch pressed tight to his chest. In that pouch, they found not coins but tiny beads of amber, smooth and golden like drops of trapped sunlight. The merchant lived just 3 days in the infirmary, breath rattling in his chest like pebbles in a shaken cup. He died with his fingers wrapped around the beads, lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps a plea to the wind to carry him home. They buried him under the apple tree beside Brother Seelan's simple cross. The pouch of amber beads lies there still, so the story says, pressed into the earth. A glint of warmth beneath roots that have known centuries of frost and thaw. Rides north with an army in tow. Of rumors that a famine has turned markets to chaos and filled the roads with desperate soul. The brothers listen with gentle nods, their eyes soft in the candlelight. They feel the weight of these stories but do not let them crack the hush that binds them. Sometimes when a novice's heart strains against the silence, when he wonders if he is wrong to love the hush while the world starves and kingdoms bleed, he kneels in the scriptorium before the codex of the pebble or places his palm on the crooked spiral stone in the cloister wall. He feels under the cold press of rock that the world's roar may be too big for him to heal. But here, in this small place, he can keep a corner of quiet, tended a patch of soil, turned a lamp, burning in the storm. They say that even the visitor, that silent, cloaked figure who appears on the tide's edge every few decades, knows the truth of this hush. He eats their bread, drinks their thin ale, and leaves without claiming shelter inside the chapel. He knows, the brothers murmur, that the hush is not given but kept. A fragile vessel passed from one generation to the next, shaped not by crowns and coins but by hands that learn to turn stone and salt and wind into a refuge for all who find its shore. In this way, the world's distant thunder becomes a kind of lullaby, not a threat, but a reminder that the hush's value precisely, because it does not strive to match the mainland's noise. The sea becomes not a prison, but a moat that guards a soft, stubborn quietness that would be devoured if the roads were shorter, the harbor calmer. When the final prayer of Compline rises into the beams of the chapel roof, the brothers feel the pull of the world loosen like a knot. They lie on their straw pallets, the wind slipping through the cracks, the hush gathering around their tired bodies, like a cloak woven from the breath of every monk who knelt here before them. Beyond the sea, lords and kings dream restless dreams of conquest and coin. Here, the hush dreams only of itself, patient as tide, steady as stone, waiting to cradle the next day's prayers in its salt-sweet embrace. Segment 5, Part 1. The hush that holds Imogen, the hour when the monastery sleeps, not with the deep, careless sleep of a city behind locked gates, but with the steady hush of stone that has stood so long that even the restless sea seems to hold its breath in respect. The chapel is dark now, save for a single stub of candle that flickers by the rough wooden altar. If you stepped inside, the air would smell of tallow and cold stone, the faintest trace of salt carried through cracks. The wind has widened over centuries. The benches bear the soft dents of countless knees, the floor worn smooth by generations of woolen robes, brushing its surface as men bent their backs in prayer. If you listen closely, you might hear the hush behind the hush, the echo of a psalm that never fully fades, the breath of Brother Seelan's quiet chant stitched into the timbers overhead. The candle sputters once, a bead of wax slipping down its base, but the flame holds steady. Outside, the sea murmurs, its low hum matching the old lullaby folded into these stones. Slip through the small door to the scriptorium now. The shelves sleep too, their spines leaning together like monks at rest. A few scraps of parchment lie unrolled on the wide oak desk, quills left beside them as if their owners meant to return before the ink dried. A pot of sand for blotting sits open, a simple bowl that has caught centuries of spilled words. Near the back wall, behind the rows of old ledgers, the bricked alcove stands hidden from casual eyes. Some say the hush here is deepest, that the ghost of lost pages breathes through the mortar in winter's longest night. A novice might press his ear to the stone and swear. He hears the soft rasp of quills scratching lines that promise the hush will hold, no matter how the wind claws at the shutter. Outside the scriptorium, the cloister walk breathes the hush like a living thing. Its flagstones are cold underfoot, a little slick where moss creeps in despite every careful scrubbing. Along the inner wall, the spiral stone sits half in shadow. Run your fingers along its groove and you might feel warmth. That makes no sense. The slow heartbeat of prayers turned to stone, the soft echo of countless hands tracing the swirl to remind themselves that the circle never breaks. In the garden, The hush lies thickest in the soil itself. By moonlight, the cabbage leaves gleam silver, beads of dew gathered like small blessings waiting to be offered up at mass. Beneath the apple tree, the earth rises gently over Brother Celian's resting place. A faint breeze stirs the branches, scattering a few shriveled leaves that spin down to settle against the moss-covered cross. Here, the hush is not silence, but promise. That care, once given, roots itself deeper than any frost. At the far edge of the garden wall, the beehives hum, even in sleep. A stray gust brings the scent of lavender, that hidden patch they still call Celian's corner, not because they needed its flowers, but because the memory of one gentle soul could be pressed into petals that hold the hush even when the wind is cruel. Now follow the hush back to the novice's dormitory. Inside, rows of straw pallets stretch along the walls. The youngest brothers lie curled under thin blankets, their breathing deep and slow. They dream not of crowns or courts or the clang of coin, but of the hush, of small cabbages tucked in frost, of a spire etched into stone, of the sea's restless voice softened by walls that know how to listen. Somewhere down the corridor, Brother Cedric dozes in his cell, rosary still threaded through his fingers. He has seen storms that nearly took the roof. He has bartered with lords whose generosity cut more deeply than any tax. He has watched novices run to the mainland and never return. And yet, each night, he lies in the hush with the same quiet certainty that the hush remains patient and wide enough to hold all those who come searching for its gentle embrace. Beyond the walls, the sea keeps its endless watch. It presses its cold mouth to the rocks, whispering stories of fishermen and pilgrims and merchant ships swallowed whole. It tries the stones with every tide, but the stones hold fast, not because they are strong, but because the hush between them binds them closer than mortar ever could. And so it holds now, not just for him, not just for the monks bent over cabbages and ledgers and half-frozen saltpans, but for you, for anyone who drifts to this island in their mind, seeking a place where the noise outside falls away and the heart can hear itself again. The candle sighs, a tiny coil of smoke curling toward the chapel beams. It leaves behind a small darkness, but not an empty one. In that darkness hums every word ever spoken here, the psalms murmured at dawn, the small confessions traded between friends in the refectory, the stories of visitors washed ashore by storms, the secrets that sleep behind the bricked wall. You lie there now, in this hush that holds you like the tide cradles a stone. The sea keeps its steady vigil beyond the rocks. The wind slides its cool palm along the cloister walk. Above the dormitory rafters, a single beam creaks, just once, an old sound, a lullaby of timber and time. You do not need to watch the door. You do not need to follow every wave that curls along the shore. The hush watches for you. Old as salt, patient as roots, it gathers every thought you set down tonight and tucks them between the stones, safe until morning, or until you are ready to remember them again. So, breathe, slow and soft. The hush will hold you long after you've slipped into dreams, long after you've drifted beyond the candle's final flicker, beyond the garden wall, beyond the spiral carved in stone. Sleep now, the hush is yours. In the final hour before dawn, the hush settles into its deepest breath. You might stand at the chapel door and feel it wrap around you like a cloak. The hush of prayers, of quills, scratching half-finished lines of garden soil turned by patient hands, of wind-rattling shutters that will not break. It is the hush that tells you that all things drift but are never truly lost. That every crumb shared, every chant hummed through chapped lips, every footstep worn into cold stone folds into this place like a lullaby that hums you toward sleep. When the bell tolls for matins, the hush does not break. It breathes out with the brothers' voices, lifting their chant into the rafters to mingle with the salt wind. Outside, the sky slips from black to gray, the sea sighs its endless sigh, and the hush holds, as constant as the tide, as soft as a prayer whispered through the cracks of stone that'll stand, and stand, and stand. So now, as you drift, half here, half somewhere, softer than thought, imagine yourself standing at the heart of this island, barefoot on cold stone, breath misting in the hush. The chapel's timbers hum above your head. The garden's dark soil breathes out its damp sweetness. The distant sea brushes its salt song against the rocks. Somewhere, the bees sleep deep in their hives, dark chambers. Somewhere a novice shifts on his straw pallet, dreams stirring behind closed eyes. Somewhere, an old brother presses his palm to a spiral in the cloister wall, tracing what countless hands have traced before, reminding himself that circles do not break. The hush gathers it all. The chant at dawn, the scratch of quills on brittle parchment, the soft scrape of a hoe through frost-hardened earth, the distant echo of a visitor's footsteps washing away on the tide. Beyond the shutter, the sea sighs, its endless blessing. The wind slips through the rafters like a lullaby, and somewhere in that hush, older than any storm, softer than any tide, you find your place, held fast in the gentle arms of a sanctuary that never asks for anything but the simplest faith, that the hush will hold long after you have drifted into dream. Sleep now, the hush keeps watch. Imagine now that you stand once more at the edge of the cloister walk. The stones beneath your feet are cold, but you do not shiver. You lean your shoulder to the ancient wall, feeling the faint warmth stored there from a sun long set. Somewhere overhead, a single rafter creaks as the wind curls through the eaves. An old friend, that wind testing the cracks, finding the same quiet resistance it has always found here. Beyond the low wall, the garden sleeps under its patchwork of straw and frost. The apple tree's bare branches catch a sliver of moonlight, each twig trembling against the black sky. Beneath its roots, old names rest, each one held like a seed deep in the hush, waiting for spring to remind the earth that care given once is never truly gone. Listen to the sea now, that slow, tireless tide pressing its breath to the rocks. It is not trying to wash the monastery away. It is speaking to it, reminding the stones that they, too, are part of something larger. That the hush within these walls is a ripple of the hush that rolls beneath every wave. If you were to slip from the cloister now, barefoot, the hem of your robe brushing cold moss, you might follow the narrow path down to the shore. There, the water would lap at your toes, briny and soft. You would stand, the night's wind combing your hair, and feel how the hush and the tide are the same. Patient, constant, never asking for more than your trust that they will return. Back in the chapel, a single candle flickers low on the altar. The brothers sleep in their cells, each one folded into the hush like a word into a psalm. The spiral on the cloister wall hums in its silence. The locked box behind the altar holds its secret pebble, or perhaps nothing at all. It does not matter. The hush is real enough without it. Now, close your eyes, and step back from the shore, back through the cloister, back through the garden gate. Let the hush gather you. It needs no lock and key to hold you safe. Its walls are built from footsteps and prayers, pages and roots, wind and salt. Long after your thoughts drift past this island, the hush remains, a low tide that never leaves, a circle that never breaks. Let your breath settle. Feel the hush cradle you. The monks will rise again at dawn, their chant drifting out across the grey sea, carrying your sleep with it. As soft as mist, as patient as stone, as enduring as the tide that hums its promise. You are held always in the hush. Now, stay here a moment longer, in the hush that feels almost like your own heartbeat. The monastery is quiet, so quiet that you could believe the stones themselves are breathing alongside you. Somewhere in the garden, a lone branch taps the cloister wall, a gentle knock that says the wind is still wandering, but not so fierce tonight. It comes and goes like an old friend at the window, testing, then letting you rest. Inside the chapel, the last candle leans toward its wick. Its flame flutters, a golden tongue tasting the chill that pools in the corners of ancient walls. That same flame once lit Brother Seelan's careful hands as he crushed herbs by the infirmary, as he traced a line of ink onto brittle parchment in the scriptorium, as he pressed his palm to the chapel floor to remind himself that the hush would hold. Now, in these final moments before sleep takes you fully, let yourself walk once more along the worn flagstones of this remote monastery. The hush has waited centuries. It can wait for you to start at the chapel, where the last tallow candle has burned low, leaving only its faint, warm scent in the stones. The benches hold the dents of countless knees, each mark like a thumbprint pressed into soft wax. You can almost hear the ghost of chants that never truly fade, old words that drift like mist through the beams overhead. Some nights, the wind tries to slip through the cracks in the thick walls, but the hush only folds tighter, cradling every note, every whispered amen. Step into the scriptorium now. The shelves stand patient, their spines lean together in sleep. The oak desk bears faint scars from Brother Seelan's careful hand, lines cut by peneves that shaped quills long worn to no. Somewhere behind that row of ledgers, the bricked alcove breathes a secret you do not need to open. It is enough to know that fragile pages and half-finished prayers rest there, safe from the sea's hungry salt. In the garden, the hush is green and damp. Even under moonlight, you can see the soft furrows between cabbage rows, the bent stalks of herbs that cling to life in cracks where frost can't reach. Beneath the bent apple tree, the earth reses gently over Brother Seelan's grave, a man who asked for nothing but to kneel in this soil tending the smallest shoots, while the wind sang its bitter psalms across the rocks. His hands are gone now, but the hush remembers them. It remembers how they packed straw around tender roots, how they stirred bitter teas for fevered brothers, how they scratched letters onto rough parchment by the trembling light of a single flame. And when the wind claws at the chapel roof, the hush hums with his patient chant, reminding every novice who shivers under thin blankets that kindness given once does not vanish. It grows like roots beneath frozen ground. Slip along the cloister walk now, your palm brushing the spiral stone. Its groove feels warmer than it should, the echo of all those fingers tracing its circle before you. A sign that what drifts away always returns. The tide, the wind, the weary heart that needs a place to rest. If you stand there long enough, you can almost feel the hush leaning back into you, as if it knows your name and your worries, and says, lay them down here. Beyond the wall, the bees hum their slow music, even in sleep. The lavender patch they call Seelan's Corner leans in the dark, its dry stalks brushing one another when the breeze slips through. You remember how the brothers once hid sweetness there, when the Lord Steward demanded more honey than the hives could bear. A soft rebellion, rooted not in anger but in the hush. A gentle promise that what is cared for will always find a way to bloom again. Think of the visitors now, those who come and go like flotsam on the tide. The fisherman with his oar split by a sudden squall, the pilgrim in thin boots kneeling in the chapel's shadows, the merchant whose pouch of amber beads lies pressed into the earth beneath the apple tree. They all came with burdens, with sins and storms and secrets they could not carry alone. The hush held them too, for an hour or a night, or until the sea called them home, their footprints washed away before dawn. But here, the hush remembers every guest who knocked on the monastery door. When the wind howled too loud to bear alone, it does not carve their names in marble or gild, their relics with gold. It holds them in the softest way. A bowl left on the refectory shelf, a prayer slipped into the psalter's pages, a half-whispered story told by Brother Cedric when the novices gather near the hearth on the longest winter nights. Even the lords and stewards who stand at the tide line in fine cloaks leave their trace. Their coins patch the garden wall, buy a single sheet of smooth parchment, mend the roof that keeps the worst of the wind from the novices' heads. And when their sails vanish over the horizon, the hush falls around the brothers again, a circle that no seal or signet ring can ever break. Outside the stone walls, the world's noise roars like the sea in storm. Crowns traded, taxes levied, armies marching down roads slick with mud and fear. But here, you see now, the hush is a kind of harbor, a circle of stone and salt where work is done slowly, prayers breathed steadily, mercy tended like a flame that will not go out even when the wind tries its hardest. Brother Seelan knew this when he knelt by the garden wall, tucking straw around fragile shoots while the sea threw itself at the rocks. The novices know it when they press their palms to the spiral stone, tracing a circle they may never fully understand. And you know it too, now, because you have walked these paths in your mind, your breath quieted by the hush that waits in every crack and crevice of this old place. So lie back now. Feel the hush gather you in. The garden breathes under frost. The scriptorium waits with its quiet ledgers. The chapel hums with the ghost of chants that never truly die. The spiral on the wall rests under your fingertips, warm and true. The tide sighs its old promise, pressing its hush to the rocks again and again. Nothing is asked of you tonight except to rest. To trust that your thoughts can drift like small boats into the wide water. To know that, like the hush itself, you are patient stone in a restless sea, cared for by hands that do not tire, rooted in prayers that do not fade. Beyond the shudder, the wind slips away to whisper its secrets to the waves. The old beams creak above your head, but they do not break. The hush breathes with you, a circle of mercy older than any crown, softer than any gold, stronger than any tide. Sleep now. You are held. The hush lives on.